Well, good afternoon. It is 4:31 here in Cincinnati, and we're about to begin lecture for week 3. And tonight we're going to talk about legal issues, a little bit more on affirmative action. We're also going to talk about major employment laws, and then we're going to discuss the Griggs versus Duke Energy, or Duke Power was called in those days, federal court case, actually a Supreme Court case, which really affects how companies do their hiring process. Now, it probably affects recruitment as well, but things that they're prohibited in doing in selection. What I have here is I'm going to go over a couple of slides with you that I think probably went over a little earlier, perhaps in session 1, but they bear repeating. Affirmative action, as I mentioned early on, was implemented by Executive Order 11246, signed by President Lyndon Johnson in 1965. And we'll talk about this a little bit later. Of course, as you know, executive orders have the same power as a piece of federal legislation, which has been passed by both houses of Congress and then signed into law by the president. What is not always known is that executive orders can be overturned by a president's successor or eventual successors. And that's not been the case with Executive Order 11246. It's still in force. Most presidents realize, and I think most people in Congress, well, I may be stretching a little bit there, actually see the need for this. One of the reasons that President Johnson signed this executive order was he saw the need for this based upon his background, where he grew up in the hardscrabble parts of Texas, where he found many minorities, especially Hispanics, who really didn't have much of a future to look to. They were you can't say that they were barred from employment, but they just weren't hired. They were hired for menial jobs and things of that nature. So what he was trying to do here, especially with federal contractors, was to level the playing field. This was kind of, this is my interpretation, this was kind of buttressing the Civil Rights Act of 1964, which of course President Johnson had a great deal to do in getting its passage. Interesting byplay about what President Johnson had told President Kennedy about how he should approach it. Johnson, as you may or may not know, was a senator for a number of years from Texas. He was the majority leader from around 1955 or so until he became a vice president. He was very skilled at getting legislation through Congress, or especially through the Senate, which is known as the greatest deliberative body in the world. I don't know if it's the greatest, but certainly it does a lot of deliberation. As I mentioned in week 1, affirmative action is under a lot of stress today. The courts have, specifically the Supreme Court, have pared it back significantly, I think. And one of the claims here against this that really is preferential treatment, and it's reverse discrimination. And notice that what the slide here said is discrimination against groups who are not protected. And actually, in Reed's interpretation, that's not correct, because there is nothing in the executive order and I repeat that, nothing in the executive order that says a company must hire someone who is not qualified for the position. And there is no requirement other than in the federal requirement for federal contractors that there is anything what we would even begin to consider a quota. So this particular slide gives us a little bit more about, I'm just blowing it up so you can see that, a little bit more about affirmative action. It applies to, at the bottom, any contractor that has, or any, let me take that back so I don't use the same word twice. Any organization that has a contract with the federal government in excess of $10,000. Now, there's a couple other levels which we'll go into tonight. And then notice it talks about a utilization study and a few other things. Step 2 is to develop timetables and goals, which I'll explain a little bit more here. And then notice here what it says. Plans to increase the number of women and minorities employed. Plans to increase. And there should be timetables with that. Notice plans, the next sentence down here, plans are not to include quotas because that prescribes a certain percentage of people that have to be hired. Notice that the objectives of this, and this is the big thing here on this slide, objectives are to be flexible. Now, they ought to be attainable, they ought to be reasonable. And then organizations have to show a good faith effort. And again, at the bottom, there is no effort, or there's no requirement to hire people who are unqualified. And in the final slide I want to put up before I get into what I have some notes here for you to pass on. These are talks about the court decisions that have occurred in the past few years concerned about admission to medical school. That was the Bakke case. That's a rather old case. It goes back to the late 1970s. And then there are issues of layoffs, and then, of course, contractor was found guilty because he or she was discriminating, guilty of discrimination for giving favorable status to minority subcontractors. So there are some issues with this. What I want to say about the affirmative action, but it certainly is not something that we need to say, well, it's completely out of whack. Although, as I've mentioned, there are specific complaints about it and things of that nature. So we really have to be careful about how we talk about affirmative action, that we're saying what we mean to say, and that we're not saying things that are either untrue or unsustainable or things of that nature. So it really is something that we need to pay a lot of attention to. We need to make sure we're on the right track with affirmative action, and we're achieving the things that we want to achieve. So not something that is easily swept under the rug or talked about. So let's discuss this a little bit more here. As I said, it's been implemented by and signed into action by President Johnson, Executive Order 11246 in 1965. And as I mentioned, it's under fire. There was a case at the Supreme Court last year where a woman from Texas sued because she was not admitted to University of Texas, even though her grades were higher than some minorities that were selected. And she wound up going to, Louisiana State University, from which she received a degree, by the way. And of course, it probably cost, well, I shouldn't say probably, it cost her more money to go there because she was an out-of-state student. Unless they have reciprocity, that is Louisiana and Texas. She did not discuss why she maybe didn't wait a year or so to apply. And the Supreme Court did what it often does, is it really did not get to the salient point of the case. They did not rule for or decide for the student. They really didn't side for either the state of Texas or the University of Texas. And they sent the case back to the district court to do some more review of specific things. One of the things that comes into question here, and it was not answered to the court, at least to my satisfaction. By the way, I'm not a lawyer, but I'm always very interested in the law. Was that the University of Texas is a federal contractor. It has contracts from the federal government, and therefore it has to have an affirmative action plan. That's not negotiable. If you're a federal contractor, you have to have an affirmative action plan. So that was there, and that particular part of the question was never answered. Quotas really didn't come into play, but that's what the student was alleging, that there was a quota, and because there was a quota of having to have X number of minorities admitted, that was really against what affirmative action was all about. And as I said, the court really did not pick up on that as well as I think it should have. For the vast majority of businesses, affirmative action programs, if they have them, are voluntary. And several of you picked up on this, especially in the forum discussions, and you cited the guidelines set down by the Supreme Court in Weber versus Kaiser, Kaiser Aluminum. Kaiser Aluminum had a voluntary affirmative action program. Several specific items in those guidelines address protection for the majority class. Guidelines in Kaiser versus or Weber versus Kaiser Aluminum. Specifically white males, and the program must be temporary in nature. As I recall, you can find that on page 85 and 86 in the text, Weber versus Kaiser Aluminum. What you must be careful about is that the court addressed voluntary programs. As long as Executive Order 11246 is on the books, federal contractors do not have the luxury of having a voluntary program. They have to have a program, and it's mandated by Executive Order 11246. So we need to address that and see what Supreme, with our case that we worked 2 weeks ago, is required to do. Now, and perhaps I should have addressed this last week, but it fits better with this week and the objectives that we're after here, speaking about laws, executive orders, and federal court cases, specifically Griggs versus Duke Power, which we're going to talk about at length. There are 3 levels of mandatory programs. The first is for contracts that are $10,000 or more. I'm going to get this off here because we're not talking about Family Medical Leave Act. Take that down. At $10,000 but less than $50,000. These organizations fall under what is known as the Equal Opportunity Clause / government contracts. Now, the majority points of the clause are a contractor will not discriminate against any employee based on race, color, creed, national origin, etc. The employer will take affirmative action to ensure applicants are employed and that they're treated during employment, again, without regard to race, color, creed, national origin, etc. This included, but is not limited to, promotions, demotions, training, and layoffs. Now, that's very important to keep in mind. Most of us think affirmative action, or we think of it as affirmative action as applying to equal opportunity for employment. But actually what it is, I don't know that it spells it out this way exactly. Of course, it's been interpreted by the Equal Opportunity Employment Commission and the Office of Federal Compliance to say that it is in all employment decisions, all personnel actions regarding employment, and promotion falls in, and training falls into that category. The contractor will state in advertisements for employment that all qualified applicants, notice the word qualified, all qualified applicants will receive consideration for employment regardless of our line view list, race, color, creed, national origin. Of course, you know there's a couple of those. I'm just going to stop there with those. The contractor will advise each union or workers' representative of the contract's commitment under Section 202 of Executive Order 11-246 and post notice in conspicuous places. Now, at your place of employment, I'm not going to talk about well, you will find most likely something about equal opportunity, but someplace in your employment where you work, either on a bulletin board or in the lunchroom or the break room or someplace else, you will find posters there that talk about the federal minimum wage, talk about a few other things there, and employers are required to post these different notices under penalty of law that they're not posted, so employees can see them. And there's some other things there. I don't remember each and every one, but they're required to be posted. The contractor will comply with the provisions, rules, and regulations of the executive order and relevant orders that come from the Secretary of Labor. The contractor will furnish all information required by the executive order for purposes of investigation to assure compliance. If the contractor is found in violation of the non-discrimination clause or rules, regulations, and/or orders, the contract may be canceled, terminated. Now, I realize that canceled and terminated are essentially the same thing, but that's what it says. Or suspended in whole or part, and the contractor may be declared ineligible for further government contracts. And the contractor must include the provisions of paragraphs 1 through 7 of Section 204 of the executive order to assure they are binding on any subcontractor. So what that simply means is this: the contractor or the organization is the one that has the federal contract, and it is that organization, usually their CEO, or if they're not that large, the owner, will on many occasions hire a subcontractor who has special expertise in a particular area. Well, the subcontractor does not have the federal contract, but the subcontractor must adhere to the tenets of the federal contract, and therefore the contractor, the one that has the contract, must advise the subcontractor of what is in Executive Order 11-246, and that subcontractor has to comply with those provisions. And so if you want to look at it from the standpoint that I'm going to mention here, it's that you have, you're killing two birds with one stone. So you have the contractor and then the subcontractor. Now the third level, and it's important to talk about the third level because that's where Supreme fell. The first is 10,000 up to 50,000. The second level is excess of 50,000, and I don't remember what the cutoff is. But the third level of control on contractors under the executive order is when the when the contract exceeds $1 million. In this case, the contractor must meet the requirements or specifications of the Equal Opportunity Clause, and the Office of Federal Contract Compliance Programs, OFCCP, you don't have to worry about that abbreviation, is authorized to conduct a pre-award compliance review. Now, since Supreme is a new federal contractor, all factors may not be considered. The most important are past equal employment opportunity performance, including its current equal employment opportunity profile, and any indication of underutilization. The number and nature of complaints filed by current or past employees. Whether the contractor is in a growth industry. The level of employment and promotion opportunities resulting from expansion or turnover of the contractor's workforce. Employment opportunities that are likely the result of being awarded this particular contract. Finally, OFCCP is very clear about what must be in the contractor's affirmative action plan. The plan must include the CEO's attitude regarding equal employment opportunity. That's a statement that the CEO makes. Now, this is very important for us to remember because the CEO is saying, this is what I stand for, and this is what I believe, this is what I practice, and therefore that's what my company practices. Who is responsible for designing and implementing the affirmative action program? Now, I'd like to take a step back here and tell you that the CEO will appoint someone to do this, most likely. In Supreme's case, they're not a real large company, so it could fall to both the father and the son to write the plan, although it may not. But the point I want to make here is that even though the CEO assigns a person to develop and implement the plan, it is the CEO who is going to answer. In other words, he can assign authority, if you will, to develop and implement the plan, but he is ultimately, or she, in the case we're talking about Supreme, it's he's, but it could be a she, is ultimately responsible for the implementation of the plan and for the operation for the plan, or operation of the plan, and the success of the plan. It is not the person who developed it and implemented it. It is the CEO. He or she cannot abdicate that responsibility. You want to use a term, it comes with the territory. So it's very important. Also has to say who will monitor the program and the applicable reporting procedures. There are some reports that are required. They may be required to be submitted to the OFCCP. They may be required to be submitted someplace else. The organization will obviously be required to keep an internal record of what they did, so they have a duplicate of what they forwarded to someone else. The plan must state how it intends to recruit, hire, train, and promote without regard to race, color, creed, national origin, etc. if in fact the organization has a BFOQ, that has to be mentioned. BFOQ, I want to remind you, is bona fide occupational qualification. By the way, excuse me, at the end of the Griggs case, we're going to talk about a possible BFOQ that most of us probably missed, and it's not new, but most of us probably missed in the news at the time it came out. I can tell you that I was unaware of it. Now, I, like many other people, could say, well, I wasn't involved in that at that time. I happened to be serving on active duty for the United States Army, so it wasn't something that was on my radar screen. But it's a very interesting case, I think, because there's a lot of tongue-in-cheek humor in the case, not intended, but you'll get it when we get there. Remember, BFOQ is a bona fide occupational qualification. Those are very narrowly defined by the courts. Most of the ones we see are have to do with religious organizations, where an organization will say that the person who works for us has to be a member of our religion. So courts usually will side with that because there's reasons that they want that. There's some other bona fide occupational qualifications. But for instance, an airline for many years didn't have women pilots. Let me change that around a little bit. For many years, the only flight attendant or flight attendants that you saw were women. And as a matter of fact, airlines actually had specific criteria for those women. They couldn't weigh over a certain amount. They couldn't be taller than a certain amount, et cetera, et cetera. Well, those were all eventually struck down because in many cases, the women, they're there not only to attend to the customers' well-being, but they're there for safety, among other things. And so they had to be able to open doors and emergency exits and things of that nature, which requires some strength. Well, eventually someone sued, I don't know who it was, and said, there's no reason this job needs to be gender specific. We can't say that it is. There's nothing there in the job duties and tasks that require gender specific hiring. So that went by the board, and you see, I won't say as many men as you see women today, but you certainly see a good number of men doing this. All employee benefits will be administered without regard to race, color, creed, national origin, etc. So these are all things that have to be in the plan. It probably would behoove a plan, the plan or the person who's going to write the plan, to consult the Equal Opportunity Employment Commission and the Office of Federal Compliance, contract compliance, to make sure that their plan is up to snuff. Finally, I want to mention that the primary focus of an affirmative action plan is on goals and timetables to achieve them. That's the primary focus of the plan. Now, in other words, what your goals are, and then how you're going to be able to achieve those goals. The goals should be specific, and they should be attainable, and the timetables should be reasonable. Now, what I mean by that is, you get the contract, and you have to have the affirmative action plan. You can't say that I'm going to meet all these benchmarks in the next 30 days. That's probably almost impossible, if not impractical. And then, of course, you give yourself some timetable to do that. Another reason is because the workforce that's in the area of your operation may not give you the opportunity to meet the timetables that you want to meet. But you know, you have to, and then there has to be good faith here. Obviously, remember, no requirement to hire somebody who is not qualified. Now, what that may mean is that you're going to have to enlarge your recruiting area. So if your normal recruiting area is 50 miles, 50-mile radius, you may have to bump that up to 75 or 100. But the object here is to have reasonable goals, well, have specific goals, as I mentioned before, and then have reasonable timetables in which you can get them. Now, I want to digress here for just a second and get some employment laws up here for you to look at. I'm not going to, excuse me, I meant to, beg your pardon, I meant to enlarge that and I didn't. I just left it alone. All right, now these are the, I think you can see this if I move this down. These are the major employment laws that we have talked about to great length early on. And I'm not going to go over these again, but I am going to mention some other employment laws that we kind of take for granted and we don't think about because they've been around for most of us as long as we've been alive. I think I can say that for anybody that's in this course that they don't go back as far as 1935 that I'm going to talk about. That first act that I'm talking about, 1935, is the National Labor Relations Act, also known as the Wagner Act after Senator Wagner from New York. It protects the right of employees to form and join a union or refuse to join a union. Now, as we do know that law, the National Labor Relations Law, has been amended with the Taft-Hartley Act of 1947. So there's some other areas in there that I'm not going to really go into, but the salient point here is that people had the right to organize and join a union. Preceding that by 3 years, in 1932, was the Norris-LaGuardia Act. Now, Norris was a senator from Nebraska, as I remember reading about, and LaGuardia, Furio LaGuardia, later became mayor of New York. Now, that act of 1932 stopped an extremely terrible business practice. The act outlawed what were known as yellow dog contracts. In those days, before 1932, employers forced these contracts on employees and they forbade them to join a union under pain of termination. And as a matter of fact, before 1932, the courts of the land, the federal courts of the land, upheld those yellow dog contract provisions. Now, I don't know what the specific name for them. Yellow dog was given in the thing. That thing came up that they'd hire anybody, including a yellow dog, as long as the dog didn't join a union or try to unionize. Pardon me. That act, the Norris-LaGuardia Act, also prohibited courts from issuing injunctions against nonviolent strikes. This was a particular tactic that businesses used for many years, that if there was a strike, they would go to court, get an injunction, and force the workers to come back, even though there was no violence, either overt or covert. Now, we do know that there is, and the provisions came from the Taft-Hartley Act, which amended the Wagner Act of 1935, that unions can go to court and they can petition the president. They can't go to court and ask for an injunction. Normally, we don't see injunctions too often unless the case of national security or national interest. Anyway, they can't go to court and ask for an injunction. Again, we don't see those. They do. Businesses can petition, pardon me, to the president for what is known as an 80-day cooling off period. As a matter of fact, I think courts can issue that as well. 80-day cooling off period, which time the workers are compelled to return to work, the union members, compelled to return to work, and negotiations continued during that 80-day cooling off period. The last time that I remember there was an 80-day cooling off period was during a steel workers strike back in 1960. That's the last one I remember. There may have been one since then. I don't remember there being one, but it's always possible that there was. A couple of other ones we have are the Old Age Survivors and Disability Insurance Act of 1935, commonly known today as Social Security. And we still have that. I know that there's a lot of pluses and minuses of Social Security, a lot of complaints about that it's going to become insolvent and a few other things. But one of the problems that we have is when we talk about this is that Congress can never come to agreement. And Congress has to act on this thing. They have to do some things, and some of them are going to be unpalatable. But Congress, the problem is we have poles of thought about what people want to do. The conservatives want one thing, the liberals, if you want to call them that, want something else. And we don't ever seem to come to any agreement because we're talking at each other and not to each other. Social Security does have some issues with solvency, or it will have some issues with solvency. And what we have to do as individuals is tell our representatives and senators what we want. And all of us need to do that, not just the people on the rabid fringes, I will say, because what we find is that the people that make the most noise are at the opposite end of each pole, and they tend to be at the very end of that pole, one way or the other. The Fair Labor Standards Act of 1938 set the minimum wage except for farm and retail workers. And of course, it also outlawed child labor, or it specified the age at which children could be employed, the types of industries in which they could be employed, and the number of hours they could work. There used to be a cutoff time. If you were 16 or 17, you couldn't work past a certain hour a night. I don't know how well that's monitored today, but it is. And of course, there were a certain number of hours a week that you could work. If you were in school, you were restricted to a certain number of hours as well. So we have to remember when we think about outlawing child labor, it's only been since 1938. Of course, we still do have child labor in the United States because farms were exempt. So, we have always hear about the farm children having certain chores to do, and that's labor. So they're allowed to do that. They're even allowed to operate some machinery that if they were out in the outside the farm community area, they would be restricted from doing. And some people have raised objections about that. So prior to discussing more recent legislation, actually, I'm not going to, we looked at some, we need to look at some prior legislation, and this is a prelude to getting into the court cases, specifically Griggs versus Duke Power. But we really need to look at some older pieces of legislation in the United States, and then ask ourselves in some respect why we have these newer pieces of legislation when some of the pieces of legislation that I'm going to speak about, pardon me, specifically amendments to the United States Constitution, were rather sweeping. The first is the 13th Amendment to the Constitution, which was ratified actually finally ratified in December of 1865. That particular amendment outlawed slavery. If you happen to see the movie Lincoln, which was out a couple of years ago, That was one of the big issues in that movie, was the 13th Amendment to the Constitution. The 14th Amendment to the Constitution, which was ratified in July of 1868, guaranteed equal protection for all citizens under the law. Equal protection for all citizens under the law. A very sweeping amendment, and so we have to ask ourselves, why do we have to have the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and eventually its amendment, the Civil Rights Act in 1991? And then finally, the 15th Amendment to the Constitution, ratified in February of 1870, bestowed the right to vote on black males. Now, the Civil Rights Act of 1866, 98 years before the Civil Rights Act of 1964, and its most important section, Title VII, stated, all citizens have the same rights as white people. That is, to own property, to enter into and enforce contracts, etc. Now, enforcing contracts also talks about employment, because when we go to work for an employer, there is an implied contract. There's an offer and an acceptance of the offer. An employer makes the offer and the employee, potential employee, accepts the offer. So these amendments and the Civil Rights Act of 1866 are very strong. So why do we need later legislation to fix what really shouldn't have been broken? Remember, it took almost a century from 1866 to get things back on track. And the question I pose to you is, how did that happen? And I don't expect you to answer that. And I have an answer that some people may agree with and some people may not agree with. I think part of the answer stems from the election of 1876. The president, specifically the presidential election. The presidential election of that year was thrown into the House of Representatives because no candidate won a majority of the electoral vote. The Constitution provides that when no candidate wins a majority of the vote, now we're talking about a majority of the Electoral College vote. We're not talking about the popular vote. That is thrown in, the election for the president is then thrown into the House of Representatives, where each state has one vote. It's not part of my conversation tonight. The election for the Vice President of the United States goes to the United States Senate. In that election of 1876, the Democrat, Sam Tilden, who was at the time the governor of New York, Samuel Tilden, won the popular vote, but did not win a majority of the Electoral College votes. Some of the Electoral College votes were in dispute, so Congress established a commission to resolve the impasse. As I remember, some of them were in dispute because of faulty candidates for Electoral College, and they had something to do with some other strange machinations, which I don't really remember. So in the end, while this negotiation was going forward, Southern Democrats stated they would support Rutherford B. Hayes, the Republican, if he agreed to provide funding for Southern improvements and end Reconstruction. Hayes did become the president, and the South won what I call home rule, otherwise known as white rule. This allowed the South to overturn laws that had helped blacks improve their condition. We then saw the advent of Jim Crow laws, which brought about segregation in all of its horrible forms. Separate but equal was one. We really ought to say separate but unequal, because that was the case. The policy was eventually, that separate but equal, was eventually given strong standing by the United States Supreme Court in its Plessy versus Ferguson decision, which was handed down in 1896. Now, let me give you a little background on Plessy. Plessy was a light-skinned African-American. Yeah, African-American. I wasn't sure I pronounced it right. And he lived in New Orleans. And New Orleans was a very open city. It kind of is like that today. It may not be as much as it was. What I mean by that is the races freely intermingled in New Orleans in those days. And so there was on the books in most southern states, the separate but equal, and black people had to ride. They had separate waiting rooms in railroad stations, and white and black, separate drinking fountains, white and black, and they had separate cars on railroad and on trains in which the blacks had to sit. Well, some folks in New Orleans decided to challenge that law, separate but equal. And so they got Plessy to buy a train ticket and sit in a car which was reserved for white people. Well, as I mentioned, Plessy was light-skinned. And so he was sitting there, and the conductor came along and took his ticket like they used to do and punched it somehow. And nothing was said. Well, the people that put Plessy up to do this had to go get the conductor and say, hey, Mr. Conductor, you didn't pay attention. Plessy's a black man. He's not supposed to be here. He's an African American. So, of course, they had Plessy arrested and put in jail for violating the law, and then Plessy sued, which was what they intended to do in the first place. And it went to the Supreme Court, and as I remember reading, it was a 7-2 decision upholding separate but equal. And that separate but equal doctrine stayed in as a law of the land, if you will, even though it was not a federal law, but it stayed until it was overturned by the unanimous court decision in Brown versus the Board of Education in 1954. By the way, I just want to point out here that I realize that I'm picking on the South, but conditions for blacks in many northern cities were not much better. So how was it that the 1960s became a ripe time to undo all the bad things that began in the 1870s? A guiding principle of Western society has been that people should be rewarded based upon merit. What can they do? How good are they at it? Promotions ought to be based on merit, etc. That is, that's merit business, on the value of their contributions. That principle is part of the American dream, and we can see this in our two most important founding documents, the Declaration of Independence and then the preamble to the United States Constitution. Until the 1960s, that dream and principle was not extended, to people of color. I know I'm going a little bit over, but I want to finish this and then we'll take a break. The 1960s saw the following: a change in societal values within the United States. The economic status of women and minorities, specifically blacks, became better known, and people were appalled at what they saw. Intervention by the federal government through laws and regulations. And then in addition, American businesses supported the concept of equal employment opportunity. To buttress these thought processes, we witnessed the peaceful demonstrations led by Dr. King and many of his associates that were turned violent when authorities intervened. American public was turned off by the tactics used by Southern police forces, such as dogs and high-pressure hoses and things of that nature. and the tactics that the Southerners used to maintain control, if you will, became a clarion call to the rest of us that the laws needed to be changed and the employment field needed to be leveled. So the Civil Rights Act of 1964 was an outcome of these reactions by the American public, and especially Title VII, its most important piece, was the starting point that led to following laws governing aspects of employment. We saw them as the Age Discrimination Act of 1967, the Pregnancy Discrimination Act of 1978, the Americans with Disabilities Act of 1990, Civil Rights Act of 1991. They all had their genesis in the Civil Rights Act of 1964, specifically Title VII. And we discussed some legislation in week one, and I won't dwell on it too much tonight. It's important that we understand, at least I think it's important that we understand how we got where we are today. Now, I know that many of you will say, well, in some cases, the situations have not improved, and I cannot disagree with you. But I think that we need to perhaps go back to our roots of the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and insist that those tenets be extended across the board. It's not just to employment opportunities, but it should be extended to everyone, that they have the same opportunity that the majority class has in all their actions. So we're going to talk in a few minutes after we take a break here about the Griggs case and then the other case that I mentioned to you. So we need to think about things that provide remedies for intentional discrimination, to codify the concepts of business necessity. This refers to selection devices and job related, to respond to recent Supreme Court decisions to restore civil rights protections eroded by the decisions, and provide adequate protection for all people. Well, on that note, at 5:24, I'd like to take a break, and we'll take a 5-minute break and come back at 5:29. Thank you. All right, it's 5:29. We're back. I'm going to, before we get to the Griggs case, I want to give you a little information that comes from Henneman, which we can see here, about the employer-employee relationship. This is, notice, the most prevalent form of relationship between employer and employee. It involves, notice, an agreement between the employer and the employee, which then becomes what is known as the employment contract, because it outlines the conditions of employment. Notice also that people who are known as independent contractors are not employees, and they cannot be treated as employees. Microsoft got in some hot water a few years ago with the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission because it was treating the large number of contractors it had as employees. In other words, requiring them to do things that they require employees to do. You can't do that, and be attending some type of meeting, et cetera, that was not specifically job related. So you can't do that. And then temporaries are in a category all by themselves. There is no special legal statute that covers pardon me, temporary employees. I beg your pardon. So we need to think about that. And to take this just a step further, this just shows how that employment contract goes together. The employer at the top is offering some type of inducements, salary, benefits, et cetera, et cetera. The employee who is shown at the bottom is offering his skills, knowledge, experience, ability, et cetera, to the employer. And so there is an offer made, there is an offer accepted, and an agreement between the two. And that is known as the employment relationship. And then obviously before that we have terms and conditions, which are the employment contract. And contracts may or may not be signed. Now I signed a contract here, and that's because that's how we do business. The last place that I worked, I did not sign a contract. I was hired. At least I don't remember signing a contract. And I stayed with that company for almost a couple days short, or a couple weeks short of 7 years. I don't ever remember signing a contract. I just know that there was an offer of employment, and I accepted it, and then I started the following week, it seems to me. All right. So we're going to get to Griggs. I want to get down here to a couple of slides, and then we'll get back into the Griggs case. All right. So Willie Griggs tried to get employment with Duke Power. This goes back to the 1970s. Well, I'm getting ahead of myself, so let me go back. The federal court decisions that address employee recruiting, selection, and staffing, especially those rendered by the United States Supreme Court, have significantly affected employment practices. The Supreme Court decisions that it renders are final. Now, what I mean here by final is there is no authority above the Supreme Court that can change what they have done. There is an exception, and that is that Congress, the United States Congress, can pass a law that overturns, if you will, the decision of the Supreme Court. Now, of course, then that decision is always up for judicial review, or maybe up for judicial review. In some cases, the court will even say, this is what we find, and it is up for the legislative branch, House of Representatives and the United States Senate, to address the issue by legislation that will be passed by both houses of Congress and then signed into law by the president. So they do say that. But the Supreme Court, if it is not challenged or the law isn't changed, its ruling is the law of the land. For instance, Brown versus the Board of Education, which we mentioned at the end of the last hour, is the law of the land today. Separate but equal is no longer accepted. We don't pay attention to that anymore. As I mentioned before, it was separate but unequal. Now, that case, by the way, had been creeping along for some time, or some parts of that. There was a gentleman, an African American, who sued the state of Texas regarding access to law school. And he won his case, and I don't remember the ins and outs of that case, but he had to go to law school a certain place. And he said, no, that's goofy, because that I have to go someplace. I don't have access to all the law books I need to study for review and things of that nature. That got overturned, but the Supreme Court overturned that. But I suppose it was considered a narrow case because it did not morph over right away into Brown versus the Board of Education, which was eventually adjudicated in 1954. As a matter of fact, the Chief Justice at the time, Earl Warren, wanted to have that case be a unanimous decision. And so he actually went to one of the justices' hospital rooms to get him to sign on to make the decision unanimous. So that's not to say the court doesn't reverse itself. It does. Certainly, the 1954 decision, Brown versus the Board of Education, overturned Plessy. And we know Plessy was a bad decision. I mean, we can't say anything other than that. But that stayed on the books for how long? We continue to have, especially in certain places, that's separate but equal. My birthplace is Covington, Kentucky, which is right across the river here from Cincinnati. And the small train station that we had in Covington had separate waiting rooms. I don't remember separate drinking fountains, but I do remember separate waiting rooms. And I didn't understand that. And as a kid, when Cincinnati didn't have that. Of course, Cincinnati had a much larger train station than we did, but didn't have it. But you ran into those things. You ran into separate grade schools and things of that nature. Now, I'm not getting into here where we have an issue coming up today where our schools have become segregated. I'm talking about laws being on the books that promoted segregation. So what we find here in your text, the cases, approximately 24 presented in Chapter 3, continue to be the law of the land. I'm talking about Supreme Court here. Continue to be the law of the land. So it's important to examine them and review their significance regarding employment practices, recruiting, selection, and staffing of organizations. And then, of course, there are some that specifically talk about discrimination. A couple talk about sexual harassment and things of that nature. We've talked about some of those cases in week 1. I certainly commend you to read these cases, especially the Supreme Court cases, because they're very important for us to think about and understand, and in some cases, understand how we got to certain places. Now, if you want to learn more about the cases, you can use Google or another search engine and then type in the case, like Griggs versus Duke Power, or several other ones, Oracle versus Sundowner, it comes to my mind, and Weber versus Kaiser Aluminum. And the case will be, and most of the time you can access the whole case. Sometimes you run into little problems and you have to search around a little bit more to get the case, and you can read the whole case. Now, I'm not going to tell you that the reading is necessarily exciting. It can be rather boring because there's a lot of legalese that's in there, and they talk about plaintiff and defendant and so on and so forth. but you can read those, and there's a way that you can kind of get to the bottom and get the guts of the case, which actually the text presents here. So there's several things, and the Griggs case is presented in your text on page 46. And there's several things that Griggs was able to prove, or his lawyers were able to prove. And I'm going to point those out to you, and then I'm going to discuss what I think are the most important pieces of this case and what the court came up with. Griggs' lawyers are actually able to establish, number one, that there were fewer Black Americans that had access to high school education in North Carolina at that particular time. The difference was 34% to 12%, almost 3 to 1. Also able to establish that there were people successfully performing the job that he was applying for, or he did apply for, who did not have a high school education. And furthermore, he was able to prove that there was no demonstrable relationship between the tests that he was required to take and performance on the job, or that the tests even related to the job. They were not specific. The test that he was taking could not show the employer that he would be successful on the job or that he would be unsuccessful on the job. It really had no relationship to the job. So we're going to look at this, and I think that I say here that, and this is me talking, no one else, I say here that the Griggs case, 1971, is perhaps the most far-reaching decision that the court made when it comes to employment and the parameters of employment and the requirements of employment and the testing for employment. It's significant because, I think it is, because it touched not only on the central issues of the case, but on other employment facets as well. The court is quite prone, no matter what the makeup of the court, is quite prone to go beyond what it is asked to rule on. And of course, as I mentioned before, it's quite prone not to answer the salient question. I give you a case in point. You may remember a few years ago that there were a large number of women Walmart employees who banded together and had a class action against Walmart. And they were alleging discrimination in pay and a few other things. And by the way, when I say they were alleging, it doesn't mean to say that I didn't believe what they had to say, but I have to put it that way because that was the premise of their case. The Supreme Court never answered the questions that these women were raising. They only ruled on the fact that the women did not have standing to be a class action. So that's why I'm saying that there are many times the court sort of punts, if you will, and doesn't answer the salient question before it, because I think in some cases they're uncomfortable with it. Sometimes I think it's politically motivated. Now the court's supposed to be above that, but that's not true. And people are appointed to the court for their political leanings. Although it's very interesting, many people who come to the court as conservatives and wind up being liberals and vice versa. But anyway, in that particular case, the court didn't answer the salient questions of whether or not these women were being discriminated against. They simply said they could not have a class. They didn't meet the requirements to have a class action suit. And so the case was dismissed. Now, I do know that some of the women are still trying to do something to get their allegations before a justice, whether it's a justice or a circuit court or whether it's the United States Supreme Court. They want to have a hearing, and that's what they've not had. So Duke Power had an employment rule that stated to be hired, you have to have a high school degree or a general education development equivalency. and receive a satisfactory score on 2 aptitude tests. Griggs, as we know, African American, was from rural North Carolina and argued that most blacks in his area were not afforded the opportunity to earn a high school degree. Now remember, this back in 1971. Probably true, may not be as true today, but certainly was true in 1971. We're not afforded, and having one should not be a criteria for gaining employment as a coal handler. Furthermore, Griggs argued there was no defined relationship between test scores and the ability to perform a job, as we alluded to before. And you can see on page 46 in the text. The Griggs case centers on disparate impact, also known as unintentional discrimination. Now, we're going to pull up some slides here from the Henneman case and from the Henneman text. Use some of his slides occasionally. And the first thing I want to talk about, this case, by the way, hinges on what is known as disparate impact or adverse impact. The first slide I have up for you here is disparate treatment. And we don't really need a lot of explanation about disparate treatment. Disparate treatment simply says that the employer treats people differently depending upon the protected categories of race, creed, national origin, color, etc. And notice that what disparate treatment says, now somebody brings a lawsuit, he or she is saying that there is intentional discrimination. And one of the big points that intentional discrimination rests upon is that the person who was discriminated against applied for a job. Now we could extend this for putting in a bid for promotion if the person was already on the work roles, part of the workforce, okay? And that he or she was qualified for the position that was open, let us say, that he or she was rejected, was disqualified, and even though he was qualified, and perhaps I shouldn't have used disqualified, but rejected for whatever he or she was trying to do, either to be hired or be promoted. And the next point is very germane to this disparate treatment thing. That the job remained open and that the employer continued to seek applicants for the job, or as I like to also extend here, to seek other people for promotion. So, and the qualifications didn't change. So here we have, I'm going to use the term here, minority or woman A, who is qualified for the position or promotion he or she is seeking, was rejected for employment or promotion. That promotion or employment opportunity remained open, and the employer continued to seek applicants with the same qualifications. Now that's a pretty serious offense here when somebody does that. So that is disparate treatment. And like I say, we don't really need to get into it a whole lot. I just want to explain what it rests upon. But we can see that pretty easily. We're treating one person differently than someone else. And usually when this happens, it boils down to because of race, color, creed, national origin, or something else that we know is protected. Now, adverse impact is entirely different. It is when an organization has what appears to be neutral employment requirements. tests that I mentioned before, high school graduation, etc., but that they disproportionately discriminate against people from protected classes. So those people, as the second bullet there, second bullet there says, are adversely impacted because of these employment requirements, if you will. So, and then Griggs went further in his argument, his lawyer's argument. The employment requirements were unfairly discriminatory, and they rendered a disproportionate number, of African Americans as not being qualified for employment. Excuse me. And the court agreed with Griggs' argument, holding that Duke did not and could not demonstrate that the tests were job-related. If that were the only decision the court rendered here, I don't think the impact on hiring practices would be as huge as I think they are. By the way, rightfully so. Organizations would eliminate unnecessary hiring practices such as requirements that were not job-related, a high school degree, and taking personality tests and intelligence tests. The court, however, as it often does, as I've mentioned before, went further. It made the following specific comments in writing. Now, you can read these in the text, and what I've done is I've tried to put my take on these. Employment practices that seem neutral but adversely affect protected classes' ability to gain employment are illegal. Well, we said that, and that really is not a whole big my take on that. That's pretty much what it says, and that's pretty easy to see. If organizations use tests in the hiring process, they must be job related. That is, the test must be able to measure how well a prospective employee will perform on the job. Now, there is a lot of evidence that says the test really won't do that. The evidence says that the test will better predict someone who will not be successful on the job. But that's okay, because the test is job related. And so now you have at least some evidence that Charlie Smith will not be successful on the job. So that's good reason that you can eliminate Charlie Smith from the candidate pool. It doesn't tell us that Susie Brown will be successful on the job, but it doesn't tell us she won't be successful. So we can keep her in the candidate pool because we have nothing that says that she can't do the job. Now, again, I'm saying this is based on some evidence. I don't know how accurate it is, but that seems to be accurate. I found this in a number of sources that I use, human resource management textbooks, our current textbook, and some other things that the tests are better predictors of those who will not be successful than they are good predictors of those who will be successful. But if we use the criteria, this test is going to tell us who can't do the job. That's okay, because it's at least job related. Organizations have to prove that the tests are job related. That is, companies must show that the tests are valid and that the tests are reliable. To be valid, a method or a test for selecting employees must accurately predict the potential employees who will perform well on the job. Now, I go back to what it used to be, what I'd said before. They're better at predicting those that won't be successful, but at least we have some kind of benchmark. That is, the test must show John Smith can perform the task and will be successful, or at least we think he'll be successful, and John Jones can't perform the task, and therefore we believe that he's going to be unsuccessful. Now, there are two things here. I mentioned validity. Validity simply states that the test is designed to measure what it's supposed to measure, and that is, again, successful or success on the job, or in the case of I'm saying the data that I've read, that will not be successful on the job. There is another thing here, and that is the tests have to be reliable. And reliability simply says that over a given period of time, the test will taken by different people will continue to have the same results time after time after time after time after time. And this simply means that it's going to tell us that these people that aren't going to be successful, it will continue to tell us that people that don't have the right skills are the right set of those skills or the precise amount of those skills are going to be unsuccessful, and will continue to tell us that time after time after time after time. The validity part, again, is that the test is designed to measure what it's supposed to measure. Success on the job, or as I like to say, non-success on the job. In addition to this ruling, the court expanded the definition of illegal discrimination to include what we now know Griggs actually argued. That is that Duke was guilty of disparate or adverse impact. The concept of disparate impact, adverse impact, some people prefer to call it, discrimination, was further clarified by subsequent Supreme Court cases and was codified by the United States Congress in the 1991 Civil Rights Act. Title VII, 1964 Civil Rights Act, Title VII, as amended by the 1991 Civil Rights Act. I made some error in my notes, and I apologize for that. It says that disparate impact, adverse impact, claim is established if the following conditions are met. The plaintiff demonstrates, that's which in this case would be Griggs, that a defendant, in this case Duke Power, used a particular employment practice that caused a disparate impact on the basis of race, color, religion, sex, national origin, and either the respondent fails to demonstrate that the challenged practice is job-related for the position in question and consistent with business necessity, or the respondent refuses to adapt an alternative employment practice. Now, there's a big thing to pay attention to here, and that is that if the employer can show that there's a business necessity to maintain this practice, and that it was not intended to cause disparate or adverse impact, and that changing the practice would cause the organization to spend an enormous amounts of money, the courts are probably going to side with the defendant in this case. So now, to further go along here, to demonstrate disparate impact under the condition of one above, it demonstrates that the defendant used a particular employment practice that caused disparate impact. The plaintiff must identify the specific practice and show it results in a significantly higher percentage of protected classes or members of protected class being rejected for employment, placement, or promotion. I got that quote from John Ivancevich's 2009 Human Resource Management text, 9th edition, published by McGraw-Hill. Now, I would like to take just a little bit of time here, doing a little bit more examination of the court's ruling in Griggs versus Duke Power. Certainly possessing a high school degree is neutral. Well, no, if you don't have the opportunity to gain a high school degree. And that's what Griggs alleged. He didn't have the opportunity. People in his neck of the woods and a minority, specifically African Americans, simply were not afforded the opportunity to gain a high school degree or a general equivalency degree. Is taking a standardized test neutral? You could argue that it is possible, but that argument fails when the test is not job related. I know I may sound like I'm beating a dead horse here, and don't intend to do that. But we really need to stop and think about what it is we're testing and why we're testing. And if the test isn't job related, there's no reason to have it. Think about this. What kind of a test do you need to take to be a coal handler? Griggs was simply taking coal from one location to another. I don't know whether he was carrying the coal, he would be transporting a wheelbarrow, how he would be taking the coal from one place to another, but that's what he was doing. I mean, it doesn't take a high school degree to do that. It doesn't take passing an aptitude test to do that. It would seem to me that the only test that you would want to do for this person is to have something that would test his or her physical ability. That you're able to do this. And if you're not able to do this, well, then you could be disqualified. That would be job related. You have to take the coal and you have to take it, a quarter of a mile, or even though it may be inside, it might be a quarter of a mile. You have to take it down the hall, around the corner, whatever what you have to do with it. And if you're not able to do that, coal handler, to handle the coal and get it from place A to place B, and you could do that by some sort of physical test, that's a good discriminator because it's job related. The following is another potential neutral employment practice. A company makes specialized electrical parts for aircraft engines and recruits by word of mouth. Now that's a test in a way, and courts have ruled that. Courts also say that an employment interview is a test. And there are other things that courts have said that you really have to stop and think about. Performance reviews are tests. That is, they only hire people who have been referred to current employees. We kind of covered this in week 1. A type of practice may be discriminatory because the workplace is populated by whites only. Organizations should hire the best available candidate and must ensure hiring practices cast a wide net. There is nothing in any law or any court decision that says you have to hire a person who is unqualified for a position. That's not there. It's not affirmative action. It's not an equal employment opportunity. It's not in any decision that's been rendered by the Supreme Court that talks about employment. But certainly you would want to be able to hire people who are qualified. And if you're going to test them, you have to make sure that you're testing for what's supposed to be tested and not something that you think is a good idea. Now, there are a lot of issues about tests, and we're going to discuss those, some of those as we move through the course, and we'll talk about them later. And I'll provide some information about the validity of tests and how useful they are, etc. There's a lot of yin and yang about that. There's pros and cons of tests, especially when you talk about intelligence tests and personality tests and things of that nature. Some people think that it's okay as long as they are job related. Some people think you're on a slippery slope when you're doing that. And so it's kind of, in a way, it's up to the person who is designing the test to make sure that it meets the parameters that are outlined by Equal Employment Opportunity Commission and also by rulings from the United States Supreme Court. As we mentioned earlier, a case of disparate treatment is much easier to understand than disparate impact. Disparate impact is subtle. I don't know enough about the Willie Griggs case if he himself really felt that he was being discriminated against, or he talked to somebody and said, hey, that's discrimination, you need to go see a lawyer. Regardless of that, we should be thankful that the Griggs case was got to the Supreme Court, and the ruling that came down was a kind of ruling that's fair for all people. But disparate treatment, we know that's much easier because we can see on the surface that people are being treated differently based upon the things that are not supposed to be used for people discriminating against someone else, race, color, creed, national origin, sexual orientation, etc. The disparate treatment, as we know, is when an employer treats classes of employees or potential employees differently. Now, the case I'm going to give you now is a case of Hooters restaurants, and we know that they employ an exclusive female wait staff attired in t-shirts and shorts as an enticement for men to come in, and if you excuse the expression, ogle. And maybe somebody would prefer to use the word leer, although ogle and leer are pretty close. I can't tell you much about Hooters. I've never been in a Hooters. The only actual close to personal experience I had with that was my daughter told me a story, my younger daughter, when she was in law school. She was working for a firm at the time and in Lexington, Kentucky. And of course, they knew she was from Cincinnati and wanted her to take some, if she would, some papers up to Cincinnati to meet with this lawyer. And she did. And of course, it gave her an opportunity to come home and visit with family and friends. And so she talked to this guy. She really didn't. She kind of knew this guy really wasn't too friendly with him. But she took it up, and so he said, "Well, at least I can do for you is take you to lunch." And he took her to a Hooters, and she was outraged at that. I don't know whether she ever said anything to him, but I know whenever I heard the story, she was more than a little bit miffed. So some years ago, Hooters denied men the opportunity to apply for server positions. Several men complained to the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, and the commission brought legal action against Hooters. Now, this is a classic example of treating different classes of people differently, and here we have disparate treatment. So we're telling men that because they don't have certain physical characteristics, because that's what the underlying message is, you cannot apply for waitstaff positions. A question that you would want to ask yourself is, why would a man want to apply for a waitstaff position at Hooters? I can't give you an actual answer because I do not know why anybody did this. What I'm giving to you came from the New York Times. What I can say is the people who wanted the position probably felt that if they worked in those positions, the waitstaff positions, that they would be remunerated well by tips. Now, a flip side of that says most of the clientele inside of Hooters is a man, or men, I should say, and therefore their proclivity to tip another man well for service probably doesn't fly. But that's the only thing I can think of, that the men wanted the jobs because they thought that they would be tipped well and therefore would help augment their income. The case was settled without court action. It means the two sides got together and worked out what was considered to be an equitable agreement to which the EEOC agreed. The settlement required Hooters to give men the opportunity to apply for positions that were viewed as similar to those of the female waitstaff. Now, had the case gone to court, it would likely have centered on the job being performed. It would have been very difficult for Hooters to provide a solid reason why men could not serve as a waitstaff. This case was reported in the New York Times. Actually, it was under the source of Anonymous. The title of the article is "Restaurant Chain to Resist on Hiring Men." Appeared in the New York Times on page 820 in November 16, 1995. And then the subsequent article, "Hooters Settles Suit by Men Denied Jobs," also appeared in the New York Times on page 820, October the 1st, 1997. And by the way, I found this cited in Stewart and Brown in their 2009 edition of Human Resource Management Linking Practice to Strategy, published by John Wiley and Sons Incorporated, Hoboken, New Jersey. This is a very interesting case to me because it is disparate treatment. There is no question about it. And it's very discriminatory on the part of Hooters. I suspect that Hooters felt they could get away with this for a period of time because maybe in perpetuity, because of the type of clients that it attracted, based upon, in most cases, the skimpy attire worn by their waitstaff, who were of the opposite gender. And so I think that Hooters probably felt, well, there wouldn't be any man who would ever be interested in applying for a waitstaff position, so we're okay on this. I use this case to give an obvious example of disparate treatment. Pardon me. We often don't think about these incidents because of what is taking place is not apparent. If you go into Hooters, like I mentioned, I've never been in one and don't have a desire to go in one. Among other things, I want to be clear here. They serve fast food. I'm not a person who likes fast food. I don't go to most fast food restaurants. I do make an exception for pizza. I happen to like pizza, but I don't do that on a regular basis. So you won't find me in the normal fast food place, whether it's McDonald's or Wendy's or Burger King or anybody else, Taco Bell. You won't find me there. You might find me in a pizza place, but and again, that's pretty rare. I don't go there every day of the week, or even once a week, or even once a month. But the only way to avoid this type of discrimination is to use a bona fide occupational qualification criteria, BFOQ, when constructing the job analysis. Now, I say here, we'll talk about job analysis, I think in week 5, but I say here, it should be on the job analysis. And why we want men to have this job. I mentioned the case of Illinois saying that our prisons that house male prisoners, our guards are going to be men, bona fide occupational qualification. The courts agreed. Some religious organizations that I've mentioned before say, our requirement is that the person who applies for the job has to be a member of our religious sect. I don't use sect here as a pejorative term. Okay, maybe our religious congregation or religious assembly or something else. And most of the time, the courts are going to agree with that because those people may be doing certain things that and how they do it, et cetera, et cetera. But Hooters could never have said this is a bona fide occupational qualification. It doesn't take a scantily dressed female to deliver food. A man can do that just as well. And maybe he may not have quite the dexterity and a few other type things. I'm getting into the looks here and leers and ogles and other things of that nature. But it goes back to the thing with the airline attendants. There's no requirement for airline attendant to be a woman. As I say, you see more men today. You may still find more women in those occupations, and part of that may be that the occupations don't pay as well as we would like to see them pay. Now I'm getting into a different area. I realize that, but that happens. Years ago, women were relegated to 3 positions. They could be nurses, school teachers, or secretaries. We call those administrative assistants today, but that was the fact. Now, Hooters couldn't do that, and they couldn't have a defense for that, say it's the BFOQ. No way could that stand up in a court of law. Good examples of BFOQs based upon gender would be in the entertainment industry. Male acting roles usually required to be performed by males, and the same thing applies to female roles being performed by female actors. Of course, we know, if you are aware of literature, that would not have been the case in William Shakespeare's day. All actors were men. Even the female roles were played by men. I happened to be in London a few years ago and attended a play at the Globe Theatre, which is a replication of the Globe that was in business during Shakespeare's time. And every actor in the play was a man. They're just trying to replicate what would have happened in Shakespeare's day. Now, I want to talk just a little bit about the assignment for next week, and that is that regardless of the staffing legislation or court decision you choose, you must evaluate its impact on an organization's hiring practices. And by the way, I want to reemphasize that the case that you choose, or the piece of legislation that you choose has to have come from the federal government. So a piece of federal legislation, a federal court ruling, preferably a Supreme Court ruling, but it does not have to be. I don't hold people to that. But whatever you choose has to be a federal decision one way or another, either a piece of legislation or a court case. I'll give you an example. Last year during the course, a student sent something in about a case, that a piece of federal legislation that many states have implemented, but it was never passed and become law at the federal level. That's not acceptable because a state law only pertains to the people that live and or work in that state. It does not apply across the board as a piece of federal legislation or a federal court decision. Now, to continue on organizations' hiring practices, that is, what changed the hiring practices for organization after the law or legislation was enacted or the court decision rendered? We know what happened in the case of Duke Power. I prefer that you don't use Duke Power because we spent a lot of time discussing it tonight. But if you feel that you don't have any other choice, I would accept that. But I prefer that you don't use Duke Power. You may wish to use the internet as a search engine to help formulate your response. But please make sure that your work is original and use proper citations as may be required. If you use a search engine, do not, I repeat, do not use Wikipedia. The reason you do not use Wikipedia is an open source that anyone may update at any time. That person who updates, we have no idea of their credentials, and Wikipedia does not require people who update to provide their credentials. You can use Wikipedia as a screening tool. So it will help you find information or direct you to a place to get the information that you want, to zero in on what it is that you want to say and what it is that you want to do. But do not, I repeat, do not use Wikipedia as your primary source of information. We have no way of knowing if the information you find in Wikipedia is accurate. Now, we have 2 cases for next week for discussion. One is the federal court case of Torres versus Coe. There are a couple other defendants. I can't think of their names right off the bat, and NYU, New York University. And then the other one is I Feel Great, which is an employment case and talks about, in some cases, potential retirement and unsatisfactory performance. The federal court case, I do have the actual federal decision, which that I will right now is you cannot access that. I'll make that available after everyone has posted their responses to the federal court case, and I've provided you the feedback in the federal court case. So please read. I think you'll find that to be a very interesting case because there's a lot of twists and turns in that case, and it's a very interesting case, at least to me, of what should have been done and what was not done, and in some cases what the plaintiff was requesting her superior to do and not to do, etc. So I think you'll find that case to be very interesting. We are now at 6:20. We've spent the last 2 academic hours speaking about federal legislation, affirmative action, how we got from several great pieces of legislation in the 1860s and how it really didn't do a lot for us until we got to the Civil Rights Act of 1964, particularly the Title VII piece of that, and then we got into the Griggs case, which I really enjoy talking about. The Griggs case. It's one of the most far-reaching decisions that the federal court has, the Supreme Court, I should say, has rendered when it comes to employment practices. So I thank you for your attention. Remind you that assignments are due by 11:50 p.m. Eastern Time tonight, and I will respond to you as quickly as possible. And the lecture, as you know, is recorded. And I'll have that uploaded to Campus Web sometime early tomorrow morning. So thank you for your attention and good night.